I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The decision required only one signature, but the sound of the pen crossing the page seemed to echo through every corridor of Buckingham Palace. King Charles had revoked Camilla's personal right to use Queen Elizabeth II's private palace suite, the rooms she had occupied for receptions, ceremonial preparations, and carefully controlled audiences. It was the one privilege Camilla had repeatedly refused to surrender. Now the king had taken it from her, permanently, and the consequences began before the ink had dried. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles read the royal directive twice before touching the pen. A royal directive is a sovereign's order, and this one ended Camilla's access to the late queen's reception room, dressing chamber, private entrance, and ceremonial preparation area. The rooms allowed her to receive guests inside spaces linked to Elizabeth's reign, making borrowed permission look like inherited authority. The king felt no victory. He felt the sadness of a husband admitting that persuasion had failed. 3 times, he had asked the queen consort to surrender the suite voluntarily. 3 times, she had delayed, redirected the conversation, or argued that her position beside him gave her the right to remain. Charles had protected her pride for years, but the crown could no longer bend around one refusal. Camilla was preparing for a reception when a senior equerry approached with a sealed notice. An equerry is a royal officer who assists royals with duties and private arrangements. She opened the envelope calmly, then froze when she reached the order to clear the suite by noon the next day. Her fingers tightened around the page. She read the sentence again, slower, as if the words might change. Palace staff moved before she finished. They received instructions to remove her stationery, framed photographs, guest books, wardrobe cases, and private files. One aide lifted the gold-embossed name card from the entrance, while another cataloged her desk. Drawers closed along the corridor, each sound marking the end of a privilege she had treated as permanent. William entered his father's study after the signature. The future king saw the pen beside the document and noticed Charles staring at a photograph of his mother. Neither man spoke. He understood that the decision could not be reversed. Yet comfort was never the true reason Camilla fought to keep those rooms. Somewhere inside the suite lay something she feared losing far more than status. And before the palace could understand why Charles finally acted, it would have to confront what that hidden possession meant to everyone standing outside the same locked door. To Charles, the private suite contained memories of a mother whose standards still governed his conscience. To Camilla, it represented acceptance she had spent decades fighting to secure. To William, the rooms belonged not to one person's ambition, but to the monarchy's protected inheritance. The conflict was therefore never about furniture or ceremony. It was about identity. By closing the suite to his wife, the king forced all 3 of them to reveal what they truly believed the crown owed them. Camilla had never seen the rooms as borrowed space. To her, they were proof that the years of rejection, whispered judgment, and public hostility had finally been defeated. Every guest received there strengthened that belief. Every ceremony prepared inside those walls made her position feel permanent. Surrendering them voluntarily would not feel like a simple move. It would feel like admitting that her place beside Charles could still be limited, questioned, or withdrawn. William saw something very different. The prince believed that historically sensitive royal spaces had to pass intact from one reign to the next. The crown's continuity meant preserving rooms, records, and traditions for future sovereigns, rather than allowing them to become personal territory. To him, the suite was not a reward for loyalty or marriage. It was part of an inheritance he would one day be responsible for protecting. Charles stood painfully between those 2 beliefs. As a husband, he understood why Camilla clung to the privilege. As monarch, he knew every concession made at home created greater unease among senior royals. Protecting her pride had once seemed compassionate. Now it risked weakening the very boundaries he had sworn to defend. Camilla sat alone after receiving the directive. She folded the document carefully and placed it beneath a silver paperweight, but the controlled gesture could not hide her anger. Staff had learned about the removal before she had time to prepare a response. That humiliation cut deeper than the order itself. She felt exposed, managed, and pushed aside inside the palace she believed she had finally conquered. Catherine had quietly helped bring the concern to William. The princess had noticed that ceremonial records stored in the suite were being treated as Camilla's personal working materials. She did not demand action. Instead, She raised the issue in a private documented briefing, choosing careful words that carried unmistakable weight. Years earlier, Charles had allowed Camilla to use the rooms temporarily while palace renovations were underway. No permanent grant had ever been issued, yet temporary permission had slowly hardened into assumed ownership. William entered his father's study and asked whether the directive could still be reversed. Charles looked at him and answered, "Not while I wear the crown." The words stunned the future king. They sounded less like reassurance than a warning against interference. And soon, he would understand why. The relationship between all three had not broken slowly. One diplomatic reception had turned a private disagreement into an open challenge, and that night, Charles realized silence was no longer protecting anyone. The rupture began during a reception honoring Commonwealth representatives, when a simple change to the evening's arrangements exposed a struggle no one could disguise. Camilla entered the late Queen's private reception room and ordered staff to move Elizabeth's original guest ledger from its protected cabinet onto her own greeting table. She intended to sign beneath the former monarch's final entry. When an aide hesitated, Camilla gave the instruction again, this time as an order. Charles heard every word from the adjoining chamber. The ledger was not an ordinary book. It contained the names of dignitaries received during Queen Elizabeth II's reign and had been sealed for archival preservation after her death. The keeper of the royal archives, the official responsible for protecting important royal records, had ordered that it remain untouched unless formal approval was granted. Camilla knew that rule, yet she insisted that placing her signature beneath Elizabeth's final entry would show continuity rather than intrusion. A young equerry stood beside the cabinet with both hands around the key. He understood the trap immediately. Refusing the queen consort could be seen as open insubordination, but obeying her would violate instructions issued in the king's name. His silence stretched too long. Camilla noticed. Her voice hardened as she repeated the order, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Charles stepped into the doorway before the equerry could move. He told his wife, quietly but firmly, that the ledger would remain inside the cabinet. The king did not accuse her in front of the staff, but his restraint made the rebuke even more severe. Camilla turned toward him and declared that the rooms were now being used under her authority. The air changed. "You gave me these rooms," she said. "I allowed you to use them," Charles replied. The distinction silenced everyone. Camilla heard the warning inside those words, while the monarch understood that a private favor had become a public claim. What she considered recognition, he now saw as ownership being asserted in front of the household. William arrived moments later after an aide alerted him to the confrontation. The prince saw the cabinet standing open, the key still trapped in the equerry's hand, and Camilla positioned between Charles and the ledger. He needed no explanation. The conflict was no longer about ceremony. It had become a direct challenge to the king's authority. Charles crossed the room, shut the cabinet himself, removed the key, and placed it inside his pocket. Camilla left without joining the reception line. Her absence forced Catherine to greet the first Commonwealth delegation beside the monarch, turning a private dispute into a ceremonial embarrassment no one could fully hide. By midnight, the guests had departed and the music had stopped. Charles then summoned Camilla to a private meeting, hoping to end the crisis. Instead, behind a closed palace door, husband and wife were about to say what neither had dared to say in public. There were no advisors in the room, no private secretaries to soften a sentence, and no courtiers to interrupt when the silence became unbearable. Charles stood beside the fireplace holding the cabinet key from the reception. Camilla remained near the door, still dressed for an evening she had abandoned. When she demanded to know whether he intended to humiliate her publicly, the king placed the key on the table and delivered the words she had feared for years. Those rooms were never yours. Charles had summoned her to his personal sitting room because he wanted one final chance to settle the crisis as husband and wife. He had excluded every aide, every official, and every member of the household. No one would record the exchange. No one would rescue either of them from the truth. The king opened a folder and presented an alternative. A newly refurbished suite in another palace wing had been prepared with private staff access, reception facilities, and enough space for ceremonial work. Camilla could move there without public embarrassment, but only if she surrendered Elizabeth's rooms voluntarily. Camilla barely looked at the plans. To her, the offer was not generous. It was a carefully disguised removal. She argued that leaving after years of use would tell the world she had been judged unworthy of the space. Her voice tightened, then broke. as she accused Charles of defending his mother's memory more fiercely than his living wife. The accusation wounded him, but he refused to retreat. Charles reminded her that he had defended her against public anger, family resistance, and years of suspicion. He had protected her place beside him when doing so came at a heavy personal cost. Yet love, he said, could not turn temporary permission into permanent possession. Camilla finally revealed what she feared losing. The rooms gave her control over private guest lists, ceremonial preparations, and several locked cabinets containing correspondence she had already begun reviewing. Surrendering the suite meant surrendering influence she had quietly built inside it. Charles understood then that the argument had grown far beyond pride. He gave her 48 hours. If she accepted the alternative suite, the matter would remain private. If she refused, he would issue a formal directive, a written royal order, removing her access without further negotiation. Camilla pushed the floor plan across the table without reading it. "I will not be moved like a visitor," she said. The monarch did not raise his voice. He returned the plan to the folder and closed it. Camilla walked out without accepting the compromise, leaving the cabinet key behind. But Charles was no longer deciding alone. A small circle of royals and senior officials had already begun preparing for her refusal, and the argument was about to leave the marriage and enter the machinery of the monarchy, where sentiment carried far less weight than succession. The final order bore Charles's signature, but the decision had been shaped inside a room where 4 people understood that every word could alter the future of the monarchy. William arrived first. Catherine carried a folder of ceremonial records. Princess Anne entered without an aide and closed the door herself. The king listened as each explained why the suite could no longer remain under Camilla's personal control. What began as a domestic dispute had become a test of whether royal boundaries still meant anything. Charles had called them into the palace library to examine 3 things: who legally controlled the rooms, what materials remained inside them, and what the suite represented to the next reign. The records were clear. The rooms formed part of the Crown Estate's occupied royal palace allocation, meaning they were reserved for official use by the monarchy rather than owned privately by any individual. Only the sovereign could grant or withdraw access. William spoke first, but every sentence cost him. The prince told his father that allowing Camilla to keep treating temporary permission as permanent ownership would make future boundaries almost impossible to enforce. He chose his words carefully because he knew criticism of the queen consort would also wound Charles. Even so, the future king refused to soften the central truth. If this challenge went unanswered, every private favor could later be turned into a personal claim. Anne carried a different kind of pain. The Princess Royal remembered her mother preparing for state occasions in those rooms, always aware that they belonged to the crown rather than to her alone. Emotion briefly entered her voice, but she rejected the idea that nostalgia was driving her. This was about guardianship. Elizabeth had protected what she inherited. Camilla, by contrast, had begun treating that inheritance as an extension of her own authority. Catherine then opened the folder she had brought. The Princess of Wales revealed through a documented palace inventory that several archived letters and ceremonial notes had been moved from protected cabinets onto Camilla's working desk without formal approval. The papers were not stolen, but the transfer showed how quickly controlled access had become assumed control. The room fell silent when William produced a second document. A complete removal directive had already been drafted. It would revoke Camilla's access, transfer the archived materials to the royal collection, the body responsible for preserving royal objects and records, and place the suite under protection until the next reign. Charles removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Is there any path left that does not feel like punishment?" he asked. Anne looked at her brother and answered softly, "Only if she chooses to surrender it herself." The palace prepared 2 documents that night. One allowed Camilla to leave with dignity by signing a voluntary relinquishment. The other removed her by royal command. Before dawn, her response would decide which paper carried the king's name. At 7 the next morning, 2 folders were placed outside Camilla's private study. The first contained the voluntary agreement. The second held the king's final directive. She opened neither for almost an hour. When she finally emerged, she returned the voluntary document unsigned and instructed her secretary to cancel every engagement scheduled inside the Queen's suite. 20 minutes later, Charles signed the second folder. By noon, palace staff were carrying Camilla's belongings through a side corridor under silent supervision. Camilla offered no written explanation. She simply sent the blank agreement back, forcing Charles to choose the harsher document. The king signed the compulsory order, a formal command ending her access at noon and transferring control of the suite to the Lord Chamberlain's office, the palace department responsible for managing ceremonial and household arrangements. The consequences came quickly. Camilla stood nearby as staff removed portrait frames, stationery boxes, gowns, guest files, and personal papers. She kept her face composed while cases were sealed and names were checked against an inventory. Then a familiar writing desk was covered and moved toward the corridor. Her control cracked for the first time. That desk had been where she planned receptions, answered private letters, and convinced herself that the rooms had finally become hers. Charles heard the removal from a nearby chamber. Each closed case and shifting piece of furniture carried the weight of his own signature. He stepped toward the corridor, stopped, and placed one hand against the door. The monarch could face public anger, political pressure, and family criticism, but he could not face Camilla while strangers dismantled the privilege he had once allowed her to build. The unease deepened when staff discovered a locked drawer that none of the official suite keys could open. Camilla immediately insisted that the contents were personal and should be transferred without inspection. Her urgency changed the mood. The equerry halted the removal and contacted the king. Charles authorized the drawer to be opened in her presence. Inside were copied seating plans, private correspondence inventories, and draft guest lists for future palace events. Several documents showed Camilla's relatives being placed in roles normally reserved for senior royal guests. The papers did not merely explain her attachment to the suite. They revealed how she intended to use its authority. Camilla gripped the back of a chair as each file was placed into an archival case. She looked directly at the equerry and said, "Those were never meant to leave this room." The discovery changed William's understanding of the entire dispute. He now saw that fear, ambition, and humiliation had become dangerously tangled. Yet he chose not to confront Camilla through officials. The rooms had been cleared, but the deepest wound remained untouched, and the prince knew no royal directive could resolve it, until someone spoke to her as a person rather than a position. William found Camilla alone in the smaller suite she had once dismissed as unsuitable. There were no secretaries outside, no legal folders on the table, and no king present to defend either side. A single unopened packing case stood beside the window. For the first time since the dispute began, Camilla looked less angry than exhausted. William did not accuse her of ambition. He asked one question instead. What did those rooms prove to you that this family never could? The prince had requested the meeting on one condition: no aides, no formal notes, and no account prepared for palace records. Camilla agreed because there was little left to protect. The argument had already cost her the suite, exposed her private plans, and placed distance between her and Charles. Now only the truth remained. William told her he had not come to demand an apology. He wanted her to understand why Elizabeth's rooms mattered to the reign he would one day inherit. To him, preserving them was not an attack on her place. It was a duty to protect the spaces, records, and traditions entrusted to the crown from becoming personal territory. Camilla listened without interrupting. Then her restraint finally gave way. She admitted that every reception held inside the suite had made years of hostility feel erased. Each guest who entered seemed to confirm that she had moved beyond rejection. Inside those rooms, she no longer felt tolerated. She felt permanent, accepted, and impossible to remove. William answered with painful honesty. Permanence, he said, could not be secured by holding a room against the wishes of the family. Her place beside Charles had to come from the life they had built together, not from occupying his mother's private chambers. The words hurt, but they did not carry cruelty. For the first time, Camilla heard the difference. The future king then revealed that Charles had not publicly called the removal a punishment. She could still limit the humiliation by accepting the new suite without protest and returning the copied ceremonial files voluntarily. More importantly, the king had personally removed language from the directive that would have barred her from the old rooms forever. Camilla could still enter beside him for rare official occasions, but never again under her own authority. Silence followed. Camilla opened the packing case and removed a folder of copied guest lists. She placed it in William's hands. Then she reached beneath her jacket, slipped an old key from a chain, and set it on the table between them. The resistance ended in that small gesture. But the palace could no longer contain what had happened. By evening, the locked entrance and missing nameplate had become symbols of a royal reckoning. and Britain was about to decide whether Camilla had lost a room, a symbol, or something far greater. The public learned the truth through one image. At sunrise, photographers outside Buckingham Palace captured a palace carpenter removing Camilla's gold nameplate from the private entrance once used by Queen Elizabeth II. By breakfast, the photograph filled television screens and newspaper websites across Britain. One front page carried only 5 words beneath the empty doorway: "The Queen's rooms taken back." The palace released no emotional explanation, but the image had already given the country one of its own. Buckingham Palace confirmed that the late Queen's private suite had returned to direct Crown control, and that Camilla would move her working arrangements to another wing. Crown control meant the rooms would now be managed for the monarchy as an institution, not used under the personal authority of one royal. The statement described the change as part of a wider preservation program, yet the timing told a harsher story. Staff had cleared the rooms only hours earlier. The missing nameplate made the official wording feel almost impossible to believe. Public opinion split immediately. Some saw the Queen Consort's removal as a cruel humiliation, after years spent supporting Charles through duty, criticism, and illness. Others argued that the king had waited too long to protect his mother's legacy. To them, the private suite had never been a reward to keep. It was an inheritance to guard. Charles watched the coverage alone. A television report showed the empty entrance, while commentators debated whether he had punished his wife or defended the crown. An advisor quietly offered to switch off the screen. The king shook his head. He continued watching without speaking, accepting every judgment because the decision had been his. The pressure grew during the evening bulletin. A respected royal correspondent described the move as the first time Charles chose the institution over the emotional peace of his own household. The sentence spread quickly because it captured the wound beneath the formal announcement. The monarch had protected a boundary, but he had done so by exposing a fracture inside his marriage. By afternoon, a small crowd had gathered near the palace gates. An elderly woman placed white flowers beside a photograph of Elizabeth. Another visitor raised a handwritten sign declaring, "Her rooms belong to history." Supporters of Camilla stood nearby, insisting that no one who had served beside the king deserved such public shame. Then the arguments stopped. The suite's curtains were closed from inside, and the crowd fell briefly silent. That simple moment became the emotional symbol of the entire crisis. A chapter had ended behind those windows, but the final judgment still belonged inside the family. When the cameras left and the palace gates returned to silence, Charles crossed the corridor toward Camilla's new rooms, carrying no decree this time, only the truth they had both avoided. Charles entered Camilla's new suite after midnight, and found the old key resting alone on the table. She had surrendered it without ceremony, but its presence said everything. For years, the rooms had represented recognition, legitimacy, and victory over a past neither of them could change. Now the privilege was gone, and the marriage had been stripped of one comforting illusion, that love could erase every royal boundary. The king sat opposite his wife, and this time neither attempted to defend what had happened. Charles spoke first. He told Camilla that the decision would not be reversed, yet he also made one distinction painfully clear. Losing control of the suite did not mean losing her public duties, her marriage, or her place beside him. The queen consort would continue serving the crown. What had ended was her personal authority over rooms that had never belonged to either of them. Camilla listened without interruption. She finally admitted that her refusal had turned fear into humiliation. She had clung to the privilege because surrendering it felt like being pushed aside. Yet that resistance had created the very public rejection she feared. She no longer called the rooms hers. Charles accepted his own share of blame. The monarch confessed in their private recorded conversation that his reluctance to establish limits had allowed temporary permission to become emotional entitlement. His final directive, a written command carrying the sovereign's authority, had corrected a mistake he had helped create. Camilla slid the key toward him. Charles did not take it immediately. He placed his hand over hers instead. The gesture offered no retreat from the boundary, but it showed that affection had survived the conflict. Their marriage would continue, though neither could again pretend that love placed them above the institution they served. William later accepted the returned ceremonial files. The prince understood that preserving them protected the next reign from inherited confusion. Catherine oversaw their transfer into secure storage, while Princess Anne visited the restored suite before it was sealed. The Princess Royal left knowing that her mother's private legacy had returned to history, rather than becoming anyone's personal possession. Charles carried the key to the keeper of the royal archives at dawn. The keeper is the official responsible for safeguarding the monarchy's most important records and historic objects. He watched as the key was placed inside a case marked with Elizabeth's name, then closed the lid himself. The verdict was final. Camilla had not lost her marriage or her position. She had lost the right to use royal inheritance as proof of personal acceptance. Charles had shown that devotion could influence a sovereign, but it could never own what belonged to the crown. The door was closed, the key was returned, and the argument was over. Charles remained king, Camilla remained beside him, and Queen Elizabeth II's private rooms returned to the crown, ending not a marriage, but the belief that love alone could place anyone above the boundaries of monarchy. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.